Welcome back. We have a new expansion, and with that, we have new herbs together. We're going to look at the different types of herbs in the War Within, and we'll have a chat about where to find them. There's new profession skills, and we'll look at where best to put your points to get the most out of them. I'll show you what you need to do to be able to see the new Camouflaged herbs. This can massively increase the amount of herbs you can collect on a farming run. We'll talk about the new special effects that have been introduced. There's new Irradiated, Crystallized, Sporefused and Altered herbs to pick. And of course, the thing I think most of you are here for, I'll share my farming routes with you. As always, there's links in the descriptions to download the routes. There's also been talk of a new farming minigame where you can plant your seeds and use mulch and stuff, but we're not going to cover that today. That might have to be a video for a different day. Here's a few really useful tips to get you started. Firstly, Druids are once again the best class for Herbalism. In Dragonflight we weren't so good because we needed to use our dragon riding mounts, but now in the War Within we can stay in flight form. So if you don't play a Druid, I'd actually recommend making a brand new character just for farming. It really is that good. If you're collecting herbs with a Druid, you might want to spec into 1 minute convoke. What that means is if you take these two talents, you can convoke every 60 seconds. This is really useful because if you do need to stop to fight a mob, you can just blow it up really fast with Convoke so that you can keep on farming. If you have Convoke available every minute, then it can really reduce your downtime and make sure you maximize the time spent collecting herbs. We've got 5 new herbs in the War Within. The first 2 you'll find in sunny places. So the Blessing Blossom you'll find in sunlit places, mostly on the Isle of Dawn, but you'll also find some down in Hallowfall and also in the green parts of the Ringing Deeps. Arathor's Spear is another herb that will spawn in the sun. Now this one is mostly in Hallowfall, but you'll also find it sometimes in the Isle of Dawn and again in the green parts of the Ringing Deeps. The next 2 herbs you'll find in caverns. Luredrop is mostly right down deep in Arn's Cahet, but you can also get some in the north part of the Ringing Deeps, as well as in the southeast of Hallowfall. Orbinid seems to be one of the rarest ones to find. This can spawn all over as Cahet, but it can also spawn in any of the other zones in dark places. So places like under bridges, inside caves, places like that. Okay, that's 4 of the 5. Now let's talk about Mycobloom. But before we do, we need to talk a little bit about how herbs spawn in World of Warcraft. I made a video about this back in Dragonflight, so I won't go over it again in detail, but just briefly, the way it works is Mycobloom is a very common herb that can spawn anywhere that the other 4 herbs can spawn. It's kind of like a weed, and it spawns in place of one of the other more valuable herbs. It's the same mechanic as how Hockenbloom worked back in Dragonflight. If you just ignore the Mycoblooms and pick only the other valuable herbs, then eventually the whole zone will be covered with Mycobloom and nothing else. So if you're going to be picking herbs for a while, you need to make sure you're clearing out all the Mycobloom. When you clear out the Mycobloom, it frees up that node and allows one of the other 4 nodes to spawn in its place. But by all means, if you're just herbing for a few minutes between dungeon queues or something, then it makes sense to just ignore the Mycobloom and cherry pick the good stuff. But just be aware, if you do go around ignoring the Mycobloom, cherry picking the good stuff, then eventually the good stuff just isn't going to spawn anymore because the Mycobloom will be taking up all the spawn locations. Does that make sense? Okay, so once you get 25 skill points in Herbalism, and you'll probably get this on the first day, you'll be able to unlock your very first profession tree. You'll want to unlock Botany first, as this, just by unlocking this, you get an extra vigor in your dragon riding every time you successfully pick a herb. This is what will give you the vigor you need to keep herbing without running out of steam. If you fully max out Botany, you'll be able to herb while mounted. Now, if you're a druid with flight form, this doesn't really make a difference at all. But if you're not a druid, this is almost certainly what you're going to want to unlock first. Other than this, it doesn't really matter too much what you put your knowledge points into. I like to try and spend my points to max out deftness. So deftness increases the speed that you collect herbs. And for me, what this does is it reduces the likelihood that a mob is going to hit you so that you have to dismount and fight something that you've just aggroed. So I like to cap out on the deftness so I can pick stuff really quickly. You might want to unlock the botany trees because under these you can get seeds and mulch, which you're going to need for your farm. I personally quite like to unlock the elemental perks as they're just a bit more fun to play around with. In the War Within, I'm personally going to be prioritizing unlocking the Sporefused specialization. This one seems to be really good as it makes it so that every time you pick a Sporefused herb, you're able to see the invisible camouflaged herbs for 5 minutes. And that seems like it's going to be really strong. So let's take a minute to talk about these camouflaged herbs. In the War Within, a lot of the herb nodes are going to be camouflaged. And it looks like probably about half the herbs are actually camouflaged. Now, the camouflaged herbs, you can't actually see these. You're going to need a buff just to be able to see them. And if you are able to see these camouflage nodes, then it unlocks a whole lot more nodes that you can gather, and hopefully without competition from other people. So there's two things you can do to make it so that you can see the camouflage nodes, at least two that I'm aware of. The first is that if you put 40 points into the Sporefused specialization, like I just mentioned, and the second is if you craft a Phial of Truesight, which you can make with alchemy. Now let's start for a minute with this Phial of Truesight. You can actually unlock this pretty quickly. If you have alchemy, then the way you unlock this recipe is you need to use wild experimentation. Now, the way wild experimentation works is that you can use the herbs that are the ingredients for the recipe you want to learn, and then you have a random chance to learn that recipe. Does that make sense? It takes Luredrop and Blessing Blossom to make these vials. So if you experiment with Luredrop or Blessing Blossom, then you have a chance to learn that vial. So to use wild experimentation, you'll need a bit of catalyst. This is easy to get. So what I do is you just craft a bunch of healing potions and then use the neutralized concoctions on those healing potions that extracts the catalyst, and then all you need to do is buy some of the dilution solution from a trade vendor, and then you can start experimenting. I managed to unlock the Phial of Truesight on my second attempt using Blessing Blossoms, so it really seems to be quite quick to unlock. Then to actually craft the vial, you'll just need some Luredrop, some Blessing Blossom, some Mycobloom, a single spore that we get when you herb the Sporefused herbs, and then you'll see that it unlocks a whole bunch of camouflaged herbs that you'll be able to farm with very little competition from other herbalists. Okay, so I've mentioned these Sporefused herbs a couple of times. Let's have a bit of a chat about what they are. So as within Dragonflight, there are 4 special elemental effects, and any herb in the world has a small chance to spawn with these elemental effects. So you could get a Mycobloom that has Sporefused, for example, or you could get a Blessing Blossom that spawns as Sporefused. Now, each type of element will drop a different type of elemental item that can be used for various crafting professions. So crystallized plants will drop Crystalline Powder, Sporefused will drop Viridescent Spores, Irradiated will drop Leyline Residue, and Altered will drop Writhing Samples. Then, of course, there's an effect that occurs whenever you gather these. So when you loot a Sporefused herb, it will cause these little green explosions that do a little bit of damage. They're a little annoying, but that's about it. Irradiated nodes will explode after you gather and will punch you back a little bit. Just make sure you don't get knocked off a cliff or something, otherwise it's not a big deal. Altered nodes will hurt you, do a bit of damage. And crystallized nodes will give you a buff that actually protects you from the altered nodes. Now, once you unlock the Unloading the Elements profession tree, you'll be able to overload each of these elemental herbs for a special effect. Sporefused is pretty fun. When you overload this, it spawns a few copies of that herb, and if you collect the odd one out, then more herbs will spawn. Otherwise, you'll get stunned. Overloading the Irradiated node will let you duplicate the next herb you find. This seems to be really strong, and you can hold this ability until you find one of the rarer herbs, such as Orbinid, and then use it on that and get 2 of them. Altered herbs, when overloaded, will simply spawn a mob, which when you kill it and loot it, it drops a few more Writhing Samples for you. So pretty good if you're farming them. And overloading the Crystallized node opens a portal to another nearby herb, similar to the Titan-fused ones back in Dragonflight. Now, when you fully upgrade the profession tree for each element, you can unlock an upgrade for each of these elements. These aren't too exciting, so I won't go into them, other than to say that, as I said before, for the Sporefused ones, this will allow you to see camouflaged herbs for 5 minutes after herbing a Sporefused herb. Now, this seems to be really good, and I'd recommend unlocking this early on, as it saves you having to waste using your Truesight vials. You could instead use maybe a vial of Finesse or Deafness or something else, rather than waste your vial on Truesight. Now let's have a bit of a chat about roots. I've got 2 roots to show you today. Links are in the description if you want to import them. Back in my Shadowlands guide, I think it was like 5 years ago, I showed you how to import these. I'll add a link to a timestamp down in the description if you want to go and get instructions into how to import it. But yeah, so that's there if you need it. Now, it really looks to me like the best place to farm herbs in this expansion, at least on launch, is probably going to be the Ringing Deeps. It seems to be the only zone that has a good spread of all the herbs. You can find the Spear and Blessing Blossom in the greenery places of the zone. There's a fair bit of Luredrop, especially up towards the northern end. You might not find too much Orbinid in this zone. You might have to go a bit deeper down into Anskehet, or however you say it, to get that one. But there are some places you can still get it under some bridges and places like that. So anyway, this is the route I've got, and it really covers the entirety of the zone. If you just sort of hug to the cave walls and do a lap, you pretty much cover most of the nodes that could potentially spawn in most places. The other place I really like to go and farm is Arathor. Now this is mostly you're only going to be getting Arathor Spear and Blessing Blossom, but it's just a really easy place to farm. There's not too many mobs that will try and interrupt you and get at you, and it's just pretty chill. I find it's a lot easier to farm down here than it is up on the Isle of Dawn. And the reason for that is up on the Isle of Dawn, there's a lot more distance between the nodes, so it takes a lot more time to go from node to node to node farming things. Whereas down in Arathor, things just seem to be a bit closer together and you can just more rapidly get more herbs. Now, Arnkahet seems to be a bit of a harder place to go. I might make a new video if I find a good route down there, but it just seems a bit more difficult to find a route where you're not getting attacked all the time. So yeah, they're my 2 farming routes. I hope you find that useful. And as you've probably noticed, I don't have too much time these days to make these videos. So I think my last video was over a year ago. So if you do want me to make more ones, please do subscribe and like. It lets me know that at least someone out there is watching this and finding it useful. Otherwise, happy farming, and I'll see you in the next one.